We've got a lot to cover today, and I've got a cup of coffee with me. It's got some writing in Ukrainian. Ukrainian letters that are written look different than how they're printed. They don't use the same letters for every letter. So it's even more complicated than you imagine. But that's my cup of coffee, not an expensive latte. Here, lattes are not expensive anywhere. They're like $1.50. Yeah, at most. You can even get it cheaper than $1 if you look around. So today we're going to cover Ecclesiology, our series on Ecclesiology, right? Which means the knowledge of church. How do we do church? Now, church as a word in the New Testament refers to the gathering of those called out of the whole collection of individuals. The whole collection of individuals is a translation of cosmos, the Greek word cosmos, which does not mean the cosmos like we say in English. That's a false cognate. That means that what sounds like it's the same isn't the same. That's false. Like recognize, false cognate, right? Cognate is to like identify. And so cognition, right? So a false cognate is where you falsely identify one thing with the other. But what we have is cosmos is translated most often the world, but it doesn't mean the physical world. It literally means the whole collection of individuals. That's what it means. So therefore we translate it the whole collection of individuals because that's what it literally means. So when we're talking about ecclesiology, ecclesia is where that word comes from. Ecclesiology, ecclesia. Ecclesia comes from ek, which means from out of, and kaleo, which means to call. So to call out, ecclesia. All right, so kaleo, call, and ek, out from. So you're calling them out from the whole collection of individuals. That's ecclesia, the church. So when we have church, we are gathering. Okay, it's a gathering of those called out. Now, we've got all these ideas about what church should be, mostly based on what we've been exposed to. Now, maybe you grew up Roman Catholic, like a lot of subscribers on this channel. Roman Catholic has its own particular flavor of doing church. And it has a very long history of almost 2,000 years, at least 1,500 years. So if you're Baptist, like I was baptized Baptist, missionary Baptist, not even Southern Baptist. So when you go to the church, you can see my church if you watch the video on the front page of the channel. That main video there, you'll see my church there where I was baptized. It's a little white church in Kentucky. Beside it, it's a little cemetery where most of my kinfolk are buried, including my mom and my daddy, and my uncle, my grandpa, and lots of other people who are related to my great-grandma who brought me to that church. And where I got saved, she took me there, and she's the one who encouraged me to go. So church may mean something very different. To me, it's just a small group of people going to a small building that doesn't cost very much, and you go in there, and there is a pastor, and in this case, he was paid, and he would work his farm on the side because it wasn't enough for him to live on. It was just a small amount. And he'd work his farm as his main source of income for his family. So his family didn't depend on that income from the church. It was just something extra for his work for the church. But he did most of his work on his farm, and he was a farmer, like everyone else. And we came in there, and everyone wore their Sunday best. All men came in wearing dress shirts and some sort of jacket and some dress pants and dress shoes. Now, if there was someone who didn't have money, which oftentimes there'd be someone who didn't have money to be able to afford it, well, then people from the church would get together and go with him down and buy him clothes. And no one would complain about, I bought him clothes, I bought him his clothes, anything like that. That didn't happen. No way. Because, the poor are the poor, and if you've got and they don't, then you help. That's how it is. That's the church that I was baptized into. And we had a Sunday school. We had little children, we had old people, and everyone in between. It was a whole diversity of ages. Now it was Kentucky, where I think there was only one black family in the whole two counties where I lived. So it was very white. Nowadays, there are a lot of Hispanics living there who have moved in to the community to do a lot of the farming and smaller jobs. But anyway, back to the ecclesiology. What I want to talk about today is well, we'll get into it. It's hard to describe it right here at the beginning. It's dealing with the priesthood of all believers, but it's also dealing with the fragmentation in the Protestant churches, which is the only single unifying characteristic of Protestant churches. You say, well, what about Martin Luther? Well, no, not all of them really like Martin Luther. And besides, who's Luther? He's dead. And a lot of them have disagreed with Luther and gone off on different directions. And every time someone disagrees, they go off and start another church. And we're going to see that with the Baptist Convention here and what happened over that, over the issue of royal priesthood or priesthood of all believers. So let me go ahead and get up here. So let me get up here a minute to where I was. Pardon me if I'm doing that a lot today. It's raining outside, so. I'm going to read to you what he wrote here about this, this convention, so you can hear what happened. Okay, so here he goes. This is from an article called The Baptist View of Royal Priesthood of All Believers by Jonathan Lehman. So it says, in one sense, Lehman. In one sense, there is no Baptist view of the priesthood of all believers. Only Baptist views. Malcolm Yarnell helpfully divides past Baptist voices into two major strands, the formative and the fragmentary. Now hang in there with me. A lot of this is kind of technical theological stuff, historical theology. I'll try to stop and explain things as we go. If I don't explain, just kind of ignore it, because it's not that important. I'm just kind of trying to read through to get to the parts that are useful. All right, so formative and fragmentary. All right, now formative is like that it formed from, right? Like it formed this way. Fragmentary means we don't like it. We're going to, we want to be able to come up with our own, and everyone should come up with their own, right? So you got formative, which is historical tradition, the very thing that Protestants always criticize Catholics about. Most Protestants actually stand on tradition. So the tradition, the Protestant tradition, especially if they point back to Martin Luther. Anytime they point back to Luther or Calvin or anyone in history, they are standing on tradition. They may say, well, but Luther discovered it from scriptures. Doesn't matter, you're pointing to Luther. Who's Luther and who cares who he is? He's dead. He's not God. He's not Jesus. He's not the Word of God. He didn't die for your sins. So why do you keep pointing to Luther? Because you're arguing from the authority of tradition. That's what you're doing. Well, it's been for 500 years. That's authority of tradition. That's authority of tradition. That's the very thing that you Protestants criticize the Catholics on. You say, what are you, Catholic? I'm Protestant and Catholic. I am. I'm Protestant and Catholic. And Orthodox. I'm a Christian. Let's keep going. Formative and fragmentary. 17th century Baptist pastor John Smith, Smith with a Y, S-M-Y-T-H. Some of these names, you kind of have to, you don't have to, but it'd be good to start to recognize and kind of, connect them with certain things. John Smith provides a paragon of the formative, meaning he gives an example, a prime example of what the formative is. While turn of the century, 19th century, seminary president Edgar Young Mullins offers the fragmentary. Okay? So one is from the 1600s, the other one's from the early 1800s. Early Baptists like Smith, together with their confessions, they wrote statements that were called confessions. And what the confession was that this group of leaders, they agree on these principles. And that's what a confession is. And I think maybe later on I'll probably pull out a couple of confessions like Westminster Confession, things like this. And we can read through those and just see, talk about it a little bit. All right, so not in this video, but I mean in other videos. Mullins offers fragmentary. Early Baptists like Smith, together with their confessions, pointed to Christ's offices of prophet, priest, and king. Now, you probably haven't heard this, that they say that Jesus fulfilled them of prophet, priest, and king, okay? Which they translate through the new covenant into the saints' threefold work of proclamation, worship, and government, meaning that we continue Christ's work as prophet, priest, and king through our proclamation of the gospel, our worship of God, and our government of the body, the church. Okay? Sounds good. You see I'm doing this European style. I'm in Europe, okay? Sorry, you have to translate it to English, okay? So prophet, priest, and king. All right, prophet, priest, and king, proclamation, worship, and government. Proclamation, worship, and government. Worship not like singing songs. Worship like offering sacrifices. That's what the priest did. Okay? Smith argued that the priestly work of the saints consists in offering spiritual sacrifices through prayer, praise, and obedience. Notice obedience. Now, you're going to say, yeah, but he didn't say it was necessary to salvation as part of our work as saints. But he's saying saints. Now, how do you get to saints? Well, obedience, he's saying, is part of a spiritual sacrifice. But it's like it's after the fact. And it's not necessary. Well, is praise not necessary? Is prayer not necessary? You say, well, what? Prayer is necessary for salvation? You bet it is. Romans 10:9 through 10. If you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth, right? This is praise. This is prayer and praise. Prayer is believing in your heart. Praise is confessing with your mouth what you believe in your heart. Yeah. And obedience is necessary as well. All three of those are necessary for salvation. You think they're not? You think that you can go through your Christian life and never pray and still be saved? Do you think that you can go through your Christian life and never praise God? Never, ever, ever praise God and be saved? Do you think you were really converted if you don't praise God? If you don't pray? If you don't obey? Exactly. Their kingly work involved them in admonition. So that was talking about the priestly work. Now this is about the kingly work. Okay? But where's the prophetic work? So kingly work involved them in admonition, examination, excommunication, and absolution. Absolution? Absolution? The king? The king absolving them? Really? That's really strange. Why would that be a kingly work, a governmental work of absolving? Okay? But anyway, that's what he says. Moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, pastors like Daniel Turner, so we're talking about 200 years later, almost 200 years later, 150, 200 years later. Daniel Turner, Andrew Fuller, and Isaac Backus I recognize, continued this tradition, placing the priestly duties of every member inside the ecclesial, that's the church, structures of local churches, led by church officers and joined to Baptist associations. Okay, so now we have associations of Baptist churches. Meanwhile, members of the fragmentary strand, that was the formative strand. That's what they believe. Fragmentary strand, which includes names like Roger Williams, you should know who he is from U.S. history. He's the founder of Rhode Island. He founded it out of protest against the Protestants. He didn't become Catholic. He said that you didn't need to go to church and you shouldn't go to church. Roger Williams. Yeah? Sounds like what we're running into today. If the churches are apostate, they're apostate. How can you go to an apostate church with a clear conscience? John Leland, Leyland is Rabbitburn. And Leyland, is the last name, right? John Leland, L-E-L-A-N-D. So it's Leyland, not Leland. So it's just like your pronunciation, but spelled differently. Francis Wayland, there's another one, spent more time emphasizing the free will, the conscience, and the individual's unmediated access to God. Wow, this sounds like the crisis we have today. We have a crisis today of the churches all teaching this. And yet brainwashing their members to absorb these false teachings. And then they go to the Bible thinking they themselves are seeing it. They're not seeing it themselves. You're not. You've been brainwashed to see that. It's not there. It's not there. You've been hypnotized. It's mass hypnosis, mass hallucination. I guarantee it's a prime example of it. Mass hallucination. I'm going to make some videos on that after this one. Today I'm going to make like about 3 or 4 videos. All right, so here we go. It says, they tended to be 1 or 2 clicks from more suspicious of ecclesiastical authority and church partnerships. So they were much more critical of the church leadership and their partnerships between churches, meaning that there's corruption. That when you have leadership, men leading the church, there can be corruption, and between churches there can be corruption. They band together in order to make it seem like it's more authoritative, because again, that false argument that the more people who agree with me, the more true it is. And that's not true. There's a video you can go to the playlist for false prophets, and it's about 400 prophets who received a lying spirit from God. And there was 400 to 1. I've told about this before. And you can go watch the video that goes into that text, and you can, with me, read the text and see. 400 to 1. One was speaking the truth from God, and 400 were lying from a lying spirit. Yep. So that biblically, that argument is untenable. That's the argument of the enemy. That's not the argument of God. That's the argument of the enemy. So when someone does argue from sheer numbers, well, that's the argument of the enemy. And even Jesus, with the broad road and the narrow path, says that that's not true. Because the massive number of Christians are going to be on the broad path. It says many will find it and many traverse it. But on the narrow path, it says few find it and few travel on it. That means that whichever Christianity is most popular, that is going to be false. That's what it means. It means that the true Christianity is never going to be popular. It's never going to win massive adherence. It won't. There may be some surges, like we see in the New Testament with the book of Acts, where 5,000 were added to their numbers in one day. That can happen, but it's never going to be the most popular form of it. Let's keep going. The enemy is always at work. So they're suspicious of ecclesiastical authority and church partnership. That's why they believe in the fragmentary view. The most pronounced voice for this tradition was E.Y. Mullins. His doctrine of soul competency treated direct access to God as the right of all souls apart from the interference of any church, pastor, or creed. Southern Baptist leader Herschel Hobbs pushed the message of soul competency well into the middle of the 20th century, helping to ensure it appeared in the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message, some publication, I guess. So this is what we're seeing today when I say that, Christians are not an island unto themselves. They have to recognize the offices in the church, because Jesus established those offices and he never dissolved them. He never dissolved those offices. And he calls men to those offices to fulfill them. Jesus calls us. You say, but Ron, doesn't the Baptist Convention, or the Baptist Church commission you to that office? Well, we've set it up that way. But if Jesus doesn't call you to that office, you're not called to that office, and you're falsely filling that office. That means that what you do in that office will most likely be working against Christ and for the purposes of men rather than God. So these two divisions clashed most publicly. Here we go. This is the most dramatic and interesting part of this. These two visions clashed most publicly among the 32,727 messengers at the 1988 Southern Baptist Convention in San Antonio, Texas. Conservatives presented a resolution affirming the formative view of the priesthood of all believers. Okay, not the fragmentary view where each Christian is unto himself without any interference. The resolution observed that emphasizing the priesthood of all believers was a recent historical development in Southern Baptist life. Interesting, isn't it? Interesting. Let me read it again. Conservatives presented a resolution affirming the formative view of the priesthood of all believers. The formative view. That must take place within the church structure. All right? The resolution observed that emphasizing the priesthood of all believers was a recent historical development in Southern Baptist life, but that the emphasis had been used to justify wrongly the attitude that a Christian may believe whatever he so chooses and still be considered a loyal Southern Baptist. Meaning there must be restrictions on doctrine. You cannot just go to the Bible and pick out whatever you want and say, oh, this is the truth, and still be considered a Southern Baptist. There must be doctrinal statements that you must adhere to. If you can't adhere to it, you're not a Southern Baptist. And this is traditionally how the denominations work. Now, it hasn't worked that way throughout history, but I'm just saying that recent history, this is how it's worked. That was their solution to it. But this is a crisis. Therefore, the resolution then asked the Southern Baptist Convention, SBC, to affirm its belief in the biblical doctrine of the priesthood of the believer. 1 Peter 2:9 and Revelation 1:6. Don't turn to it. We'll get to it in a minute, okay? Yet it wanted this affirmation hemmed in, so it wanted to affirm it, but it wanted limited by three qualifications. One, that this doctrine in no way gives license to misinterpret, explain away, demythologize, which is to treat Jesus and miracles like mythology, or extrapolate out elements of the supernatural from the Bible. Like, not extrapolate out, it means extract. Extrapolate is the wrong word. I don't know who wrote that in their proposal, but it was someone uneducated. Extract out, like take it out of the Bible. The miracles don't belong in the Bible. And that's what Thomas Jefferson did. The Jefferson Bible is simply the Bible with all the miracles and the deity of Jesus, all those passages, literally cut out of the Bible. That's what Jefferson did. He didn't like it. He didn't believe in the deity of Jesus, and he didn't believe in miracles, so he cut all those out. And the rest of it, he says, okay, I can believe in that. Terrible. That's called the Jefferson Bible. So if you ever get your hands on a Jefferson Bible, you'll know what you're touching. I'd stay away from it. All right, but they're saying that you can't do that. Okay? We don't mind affirming the priesthood of all believers, but with these limitations. You can't do these things. And number two, that it in no way contradicts the biblical understanding of the role, responsibility, and authority of the pastor, which is seen in the command of the local church in Hebrews 13:17, obey your leaders and submit to them. And point number three, that elders or pastors are called of God to lead the local church, Acts 20:28. The resolution passed 54.75% to to 45.25%. Can you believe how many people disagreed with that? How many people by 1988 in the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest denomination in America, disagreed with it? It's almost half. Disappointed moderates marched from the convention center in San Antonio to the Alamo. The Alamo, it's a symbol of rebellion, because remember that Texas used to be part of Mexico, and Mexico wanted to populate that area of Texas, and so they offered to Americans that if they come down and buy some land, that they will not be charged taxes on it. It'll be tax-free. But they have to marry a Mexican. So they have to come down, marry a Mexican, buy land, and it'll be tax-free. Once they did that, they got settled in, then he changed the rules and started charging taxes. So then they refused to pay the taxes. And so, of course, they marched on the Texans with the army. And the Texans called for help from the Americans. And the Texans had actually declared themselves independent of Mexico. They were an independent country, according to their own declaration. They were rebelling against Mexico to leave it. And so the Mexicans sent in their army, and they're not Americans. They were Americans. They were now Texans who were really Mexicans because they're rebelling against Mexico. They'd become Mexican citizens. And so they were fighting at the Alamo. That was the last stand, waiting for the cavalry from America to come in and rescue them. Well, they came too late. And so everyone at the Alamo was killed. Of course, they were rebels. They were killed. And Santa Anna killed them. And there was one person who had escaped, who had gone off to give the message that they needed help. He had survived, but that's it. So anyway, the Alamo still stands today as a monument, and because Texas then, with the help of the Americans, they agreed to become part of the U.S. And so the Alamo stands today as a symbol of rebel sentiment. That if we don't like the government, we're going to stand against it. That kind of thing. It's a rebellious attitude, and America has many of these monuments to rebellious attitude, where they refuse to submit to authority. And that's one thing that we as Americans have to pay special, careful attention to, that we do not just find whatever reason we can to refuse to submit to authority. Authority is a very important issue in the Bible. We cannot do that. Jesus didn't come to rebel against authority. Neither did the apostles. So let's keep going here. All right, so they went to the Alamo singing, "We Shall Overcome." Okay? That's a hymn. I think it's a Luther hymn. Upon arriving, they tore up their paper copies of the resolution and sang Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," indicating that they're creating another Reformation against a new Catholic Church. That's what I told you. I said that Protestant churches are children of the Catholic Church. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as we say. So all the things you hated about the Catholic Church are now in the Protestant Church, but even worse. The Protestant is the huge monster in the room, not the Catholics. You already criticized the Catholics enough. I don't need to criticize them. Plenty of Protestants doing an adequate job, more than adequate, even a blasphemous job. But the Protestants go uncriticized, and yet they are the monster in the room. They are the huge, gigantic monster, the Antichrist in the room. So let's keep going. They regard the whole affair as an assault on lay leadership and as an endorsement of pastoral dominance. They love coming up with these small cliche or click phrases that stick in your head that make you stand against something. So pastoral dominance. Oh, well, he shouldn't be domineering. Well, who knows if he is? Maybe the pastors aren't being domineering, but they just don't want anyone telling them they're wrong or anyone telling them what to do or what to think. You say, Ron, well, no one should tell you what to think. Why not? Don't you have teachers? Yeah. How are you going to learn anything? Anything you read tells you what to think. Anyone you listen to who's teaching tells you what to think. Well, that's not true. Of course it's true. Oh, that's not true. Of course it's true. Of course it's true. Absolutely true. Think about it a minute. It is true. I'm doing it right now to you. I'm telling you what to think. Right? Right. That's the role of teachers, is to help you to think by telling you what to think and then letting you try to think on your own. You have to be told what to think in order to be able to think on your own. I remember teaching music. I'm a musician, right? And I was a pastor in the church as a music leader. And that wasn't the first pastoral role, but that was one of them that I performed. And so I pastored the musicians as well. I also taught music on my own at the university, not for the university. I was at the university holding classes using their space. And many times I'd have guys come in saying, well, I don't really need to learn anything about music. I just need to just play whatever's in my heart. Yeah, whatever's in my heart, I just play it. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, play. Yeah? You feel like Led Zeppelin? Play Led Zeppelin. Or that style. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know anything. Well, yeah, of course you don't know anything. You've got to first learn what other people have done with your hands. You got to learn it, right? When you get enough of this together, then you can start creating your own variations or combinations, or you like this little tiny part of a riff, and this full riff over here and this little one over here from 3 different artists. You take and put them together, and then you can come up with your own stuff in between. That's how it's done. That's how thinking is done. That's how thinking is done. All this is to say, it's difficult to speak in the singular about a Baptist perspective on the priesthood of believers. So what we saw here was that the Southern Baptist Convention of 1988 proved my point about Protestants. The only unifying factor is fragmentation. 45.25% of them fragmented on that day from the SBC. I don't know that all of them left the SBC, but it says that group tore up their paper copies of the resolution and started singing rebel songs and marched to a monument that is to celebrate rebellion. You can't get a louder statement than that. That is what Protestantism is. It is nothing else. Protestantism is nothing else. You say, oh, Ron, but it's restoring the historic church and how we do church. It is not. It is not. Look at how many different ways of doing church there are in the Protestant churches, and they all disagree on it. So how can you sit there thinking you're the authority over all the people throughout history of the Protestant churches to say that you know what the historic Christian church should look like, and all of them think the same thing, and they've displayed that they don't know what it looked like because they have all of these different variations on it that all contradict each other. Think about it. Are you smarter than all of these people through the past 500 years, going back to Martin Luther? That you know what the historic Christian church should look like? Well, Ron, I can just read my Bible. You can read your Bible, but can you understand it? Can you understand that topic in the Bible by yourself? What about the translation? Because you're reading a translation, you're not actually reading the Bible. You know that. The English Bible, this is not the Bible. It says Holy Bible on the front, but that's a lie. It's not. It should say translation of the Holy Bible. It should not say Holy Bible. This is not the Holy Bible. It's a translation. The Holy Bible is in Greek. So what about Hebrew? The Hebrew Old Testament, you've heard me say it before, is the Masoretic text, which was created in 900 AD. AD, not BC, AD, is written 900 years after Christ. The Old Testament. So then how did Christ and the apostles use the Old Testament if it was written 900 years afterwards? Because they weren't using the Hebrew Old Testament. They're using the Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint, which was written 230 years before Christ by the Jews. It was a translation of the Hebrew into Greek. We don't have the Hebrew. We don't have the Hebrew. There's a reason for that. We may not know why, but there's a reason for it. God did not allow the Hebrew Old Testament to survive. He allowed the Greek Old Testament to survive, and that's what we have. This is not the Bible. It's a translation of the Bible into English. And your understanding of the Bible itself, underlying it in the Greek, is either better or worse based on how accurate the translations are. So let's get that out of the way, okay? He says, all this is to say it's difficult to speak in a singular about a Baptist perspective on the priesthood of believers. Exactly my point. But that's true of every topic. Still, inside this energetic tension, are you joking? Are you joking? Energetic tension is an understatement. It's a rebellion. It is an outright rebellion. They made that absolutely crystal clear. No idiot on this earth would think it's just energetic tension. And yet this idiot wants to try to dupe you, thinking you're stupid. Surely you're not stupid enough to think it's just an energetic tension with the things that they did. We shall overcome. Marching out of the Southern Baptist Convention where they lost the vote count on this issue. They marched out saying, we shall overcome. Tore up their papers. Upon arriving at the Alamo, they tore up the papers of the resolution. Tore it up. They didn't just disagree with it, they tore it up. We reject it. And sang Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" at the Alamo, calling, like the Alamo, their mighty fortress. You know what happened at the Alamo? They were all killed. They were all murdered. They were rebels and they received their just due. Still, inside this energetic tension between the formative and fragmentary traditions, we find fodder for understanding what may be unique in the Baptist perspective on this doctrine. No, we don't. We don't. We don't find fodder. Fodder is like leftover stuff. It's terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. So you see that the Protestants fought against the Catholics over clericalism, the priests, class of priests. And yet we have the same. The pastors and the elders are not like the congregants. They're not. And they're not treated like that by the congregants at all. The congregants come to the pastor as if he's someone special. You cannot help that. Why did they do that? Why did they develop that? It's unavoidable. People need a leader. People need a shepherd who's there in the flock shepherding. You cannot get around it. There are offices established in the church by Christ himself. You cannot dissolve those. If you try to put a church together that doesn't have them, it's utter chaos. That church never grows. It doesn't. It doesn't become mature. It never grows. a small church in Riverside, California. I visited for some time, a little over a year, I think. And they were part of one of the Brethren branches, and they didn't believe in having a hired pastor. And so they believed in distributing the work among all of the brothers in the church, the men. So all the men would take turns doing things, whether it's preaching, whether it's administering communion, but they didn't take turns in terms of leading worship. There were only 2 or 3 who did that. But I think that was because there weren't more people who had musical abilities. So anyway, that's what they did, okay? Well, they thought themselves very mature. But you know, one of the last things I heard when I was leaving from one of the 2 main leaders, their fathers, these 2 men, their fathers established this church. And so the one man said, well, you know, we're thinking about, I think it was once saved, always saved, about taking that on as a doctrine. Yeah, these are not young people. They've been in the Lord since they were born, you know, so to speak. They're raised by pastors who established that church. And most of the people in this church are older. They're like retired or close to retirement. You know, I mean, they've been in the Lord a long time. And yet they still are buffeted by winds of doctrine. They have not grown up into maturity. Why? Because they do not have concrete men called by Christ into concrete positions in the church. I'm not saying there need to be paid positions. You know my position on that if you've viewed my videos. No, not paid positions, but there should be concrete positions where men who are called by Christ fulfill those concrete positions. And I didn't see that. I didn't see that. When you don't have that, then the flock, you know, they don't know what to think. They need to know what to think. You need to be a pillar in the temple of your God. Unmovable in the temple, knowing intimately the truth of Christ. And if you don't, then who does? You need to be that pillar. If you are a teacher, if you're a pastor, if you're an evangelist, if you're an apostle, if you're a prophet, you need to be that person. So, there's no way avoiding that. Are there 2 different classes of Christians? I wouldn't use the word class because it's political. This isn't a political issue. There are Christians who are further along in their walk. There are Christians who have overcome sin. There are Christians who haven't. But they must, no matter how young they are. And we already talked about that. That even the infants in Christ are told to stop sinning. Young men have overcome it. So what of fathers? And fathers should be the elders in the church. They must not sin. And yet when there's sin, there's rebellion. And when you don't preach, stop sinning, you will have fragmentation. It's unavoidable. And if you don't want fragmentation, but you don't want to teach people to stop sinning, you're going to have an iron fist ruling over them. With the power that's in the secular authority in your hands. That's why you had that struggle between the popes and the kings throughout the Middle Ages. Because they weren't teaching to stop sinning. And yet they were trying to tightly control the fragmentation from happening. And you kept seeing it trying to happen. 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, boom! It explodes. That's the problem. It's a problem with the doctrine. If you don't teach that they have to stop sinning, then you're going to have the church filled with people who are still sinning. And no one will have any understanding. Job 28:28, for the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. If you do not shun evil, you have no understanding. If the church is full of people who are not shunning evil, it's full of people who do not have understanding, including the leaders. We're still on ecclesiology with all of this. I haven't even talked about the priesthood of all believers yet. I'm just talking about the fragmentation in Protestantism. How the Catholics tried to keep from being fragmented. And the only reason why the Protestant Reformation actually happened was because Martin Luther got political power behind him and the princes who wanted to reclaim some lands from the church. They wanted some of the lands from the church. I don't know if it was reclaimed or not. Some of them it was reclaimed, some it wasn't. They just were greedy. So anyway, they got behind Luther and he had political power. And so that attempt of the church to use political power to contain the fragmentation suddenly had a threat of one of those fragmenters who was backed by political power. And in Germany, there was no federal government at the time. There were princes who governed different regions. And so the princes backed up Martin Luther. That's why the Protestant Reformation succeeded, in spite of the Roman Catholic Church trying to use an iron fist of the secular authorities to control these fragmenters. And typically they would take, and if they didn't listen to the Pope and stop, then what they would do is they'd take the additional measures to arrest them, try them, tie them to a piece of wood, if they wrote things, put their writings, all the books they could find of the writings at the base of the wood, and then set it on fire and burn them at the stake as a heretic. Now, if the person was a clergy, they would have to first defrock him, which means to take away his clerical authority. So the church first had to conduct an investigation, determine he's a heretic, take away his clerical authority, hand him over to the secular authority, the king, the Holy Roman Emperor, and then they would try him, find him guilty instantly, and then they would be the ones who actually tied him to the stake, put his books at the base, set it on fire, and burn him. But since he wasn't a clergy, they were not going to go to hell. Now, if he was not defrocked, they would go to hell for burning the clergy. That's how it worked. All right, so now you know the truth about these things. And this is a modern day prime example of the fragmentation, major fragmentation. And that rebellious attitude that is bred into Protestants, that we who come out of the Protestant churches need desperately to fight against. That is the number one feature of our character that we need to fight against, is rebellious nature. May the Lord bless you as you seek Him with all your heart.